Good evening, everyone. My name is Mansha. I'm one of the directors here at CQ. And on behalf of our organization, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you to the second session of TerraEco series. After the success of our launch session, we are very thrilled to continue of exploring this critical issue at the intersection of sustainability, policy, and innovation. For those of you who might be new here, our organization is a youth-led initiative under the Millennium Campus Network Fellowship, a program aligned with the United Nations Academic Impact. We envision a world where young individuals are not just participants, but active decision makers in climate policy. Our mission is to empower youth to drive ambitious climate change, align with sustainable development goals, and bring meaningful change in our communities and beyond. And today we focus on a very incredibly timed and significant topic at hand, the economic impact of decarbonization. And to help us understand the various facets of decarbonization as an environmental necessity, we have with us a very distinguished expert in this domain, Dr. Badri Narayanan Gopalkrishnan. He's a fellow and former head of trade, commerce, and strategic economic policy at NITI Aayog, Government of India. With Sir having a very industrialist career in economic policy, sustainable development, he has been a very visionary leader in analyzing and addressing the complexities of global economic transition. And we're very glad to have you here with us today, sir. Over to Vaishnavi, who is also a founder president. She'll be moderating this session for us today. You can start, Vaishnavi.
Sure, Mansha. Thank you. Thank you for the brief introduction and welcoming you, sir. Thank you for taking time to be here in this session to share your expertise and economic impact of decarbonization. So I would just like to start with your, your opening remarks on this issue. How do you think that decarbonization has economic impacts, basically, and how exactly we can move ahead with this climate crisis, which is ahead in the world, and climate financing things?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vaishnavi, Mansha, and all the colleagues here in CQ. So, this topic is very important now for many countries in the world. Almost, I would say, all countries in the world. If you think about some 2 decades ago, there was a lot of disagreements and divisions across the world as to who has to take the burden of decarbonization or reduction of emissions. And I think to this group, I don't have to explain why this is important, why emissions reduction is important, right? So if I'm addressing an audience that is focused mainly on economic policy, then I have to explain them that this is very much an economic issue. Climate change and the mitigation, adaptation, and reduction of emissions. All these things are very much an economic issue. Because of the damages coming from the climate change, and because of the transition strategies that are expensive, are going to cost a lot to the economy and the society. So should we bear the costs upfront and mitigate, or should we bear the costs of climate change later and do some kind of adaptation? So all these are, dilemma and policy challenges that are in front of many economic policymakers across the world. Now, as I mentioned a few years ago, maybe 2-3 decades ago, when Kyoto Protocol was launched, it was almost kind of an impasse between the developed and developing countries. Particularly the US did not want to join the protocol, and they said it's a burden of the countries that are growing fast, that are that are kind of responsible for all the marginal increase in emissions. And they should step up, which are basically the developing countries like India and China, whereas the developed countries should not take a lot of burden. So that was the stance of the US. So they did not join the Kyoto Protocol, but the other developed countries joined. So there were a lot of important mechanisms that were developed, like clean development mechanism, where the developed countries can take credit for emissions reduction in the developing countries funded by them, and so on. So now all these things were happening. There was a tussle between the developing and developed countries, like particularly India and China. Their stances for a long time was that um, we have a lot of poor people and a lot of poverty to address. That is our fundamental, focus, and there is no point in ignoring that and focusing merely on emissions reduction. And also, even more importantly, the developed countries have had their right to do whatever they want to increase their economic stature in the world. So, and we are in the early stage of what they were going through, and how can we be deprived of the convenience and comfort to be able to grow without any restriction on the environmental side. So these were all a lot of arguments going on, and until Paris Agreement happened, Copenhagen Accord, Paris Agreement. So these things happened in the last decade. This was all going on, and ultimately the developing countries also agreed. And when you think about the Indian leadership in the last few years, they also have been very vocal on promoting sustainability, reducing emissions, and this is a shared burden of the entire world, and we are going to do our bit, and we have committed for a substantial reduction in emissions. So I won't get into the details of the numbers there, but definitely it's a very steep target for India, for China, for all countries in the world, pretty much. So now, and then we have had this COP conferences. Currently, COP 29 is going on in Baku, Azerbaijan. Last year, we had this happening in the UAE. So in all these conferences, there have been a lot of discussion on how different countries should collaborate, and there is this nationally determined contributions in terms of emissions reduction, and you have conditional and unconditional. So unconditional is what the countries would reduce irrespective of what kind of aid they are getting. Conditional is dependent on the aid, financial and technological aid that they can get from the developed countries. So I've been looking into this in the context of Asian countries, in the context of African countries, and also the Middle Eastern countries, and also countries across the world. So the many influences we have been getting through these analysis and these studies, in the context of Asian countries, the emissions reduction is definitely going to cost the different economies, because after the Paris Agreement was signed, and if you look at how much are we on track compared to the commitments that we have been making, most countries have not been on track. In fact, almost all countries. We have been increasing our emissions rather than reducing them. Maybe at best, we are freezing our emission intensity. So the emission intensity is roughly the carbon emissions per dollar of GDP, let's say. So if that is frozen, then when the GDP increases, emissions also would grow because emission intensity is same. Or maybe emission intensity can fall, but the GDP growth may be faster, so the emissions may increase too. So this is situation right now. And if we want to really reach some of these targets, we have to be very, very aggressive in terms of emissions reduction. Same thing can be said of African countries too. So, and now, how do we get there? Of course, one is increase in energy efficiency. So all the countries are focusing on reducing energy use, um, you know, just by reducing the inefficiencies there. Even if you, for example, continue to use a lot of fossil fuels, how about increasing the efficiency of use? So less energy input for the same output that we are generating. That is one kind of strategy that countries like India, you know, taken. The second strategy is increase in the share of renewables. How much how much of the electricity that you produce comes from renewables, for example, hydro, solar, wind, and so on. That's the second. And the third is not just energy, but also other emissions intensive sectors like reduced use of chemicals, um, or maybe nowadays we are also talking about the digital economy, where maybe we can say, for example, this meeting we are having now, it probably may be a technical analysis one has to do to see whether this, the emissions generated by this meeting right now through the digital cloud, Zoom cloud, and so on, are these higher than the emissions that have been incurred if all of us come to one city, one room, and done this, right? Uh, from simple, common sense analysis, it appears like this is definitely, lower emissions doing it Zoom because I'm here in the US and you're all across the country in India. So it would have taken a lot of different flight trips, train trips to, and it will cause a lot of emissions. But you never know. The emissions caused by the digital economies they're also very high. So all these different things are being thought about. Like the emissions reduction or energy efficiency improvements that can come from the digital economy, AI, and so on, and the increase that can come from them. So these are all being considered. And broadly, what we see is that there are opportunities and challenges for the developing countries, since the primary the broad topic of this discussion is about economic impact, right? So the positive economic impact from decarbonization would be the opportunities for the countries to specialize in certain technologies. Renewable energy is a huge area. You have, for example, countries have to produce wind energy turbine, countries have to produce solar panels. You need a lot of different minerals because even renewable energy needs a lot of minerals, right? Critical minerals. You need battery, you need storage. So all this infrastructure has to be developed across the world, and and that all needs a lot of industrial activity, and that can lead to economic growth in the developing countries.
Thank you so
So,
much. Okay. Please complete, sir.
yeah. So, yeah, that's the economic opportunity or positive impact. And the negative impact, we all know, is that there's going to be a little bit of drag on the economic growth because this is a constraint. So, fossil fuel sectors invariably have to decline. So, again, that's going to have a negative impact. And also, many other conventional sectors may decline. So, that's also going to have a negative. And one other important point to note is that renewable energy sectors are typically less labor intensive. Initially, during the installation, during the initial stages, there may be a lot of labor needed, but once installation is done, for maintenance and for operations, the labor requirements are lower. So given that the population is increasing and the labor force is increasing over time, this can be a challenge for labor. So there is this angle between trade, labor, and climate change, which is very sensitive and tricky. So yeah, over to you, Vaishnavi.
Thank you so much, sir. Understanding these economic negative and positive impacts from the climate change, and no, of course, there are no positives. I'm so sorry, but I think when we're talking about economic impacts, we are really confused a little more about how are we actually when we're saying that we're measuring emissions. This meeting is itself emitting a lot of carbon by itself on cloud and using internet. But so I just want to know, and I want you to just throw some light on these. Measuring instruments of carbon emissions, like how exactly in economics or how exactly we are actually trying to measure such emissions, how actually we are moving forward with the process of measuring carbon emissions in economic concept. What is the basic theory behind this emission measuring, and basically carbon pricing as well?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and there are various different methodologies to do this. Of course, let me talk first about the macro level, right? So macro level is relatively speaking easier. We have many of you may be familiar with input-output tables. And so input-output tables are matrices in which you have the industries in the columns and the commodities in the rows. For example, to produce $1 worth of, let's say, rice, what are the various inputs needed? Right? It may be fertilizers, it may be water, it may be land use, it may be labor, all these different elements. Some of them are primary factors, some of them are secondary inputs, intermediate inputs. So now, when we do this, for every industry, you will also have a bunch of energy sectors or energy commodities there. So if to produce $1 worth of rice, how much electricity is needed? And of that electricity, how much comes from solar, wind, thermal, and so on. So this breakup is needed. And once this breakup is there, you can assign each production, each sector of production to certain uh, tons of uh, you know oil equivalent in terms of energy, right? So oil is kind of the gold standard for energy, and when you say oil equivalent, that means um, if you're using coal, how much coal is needed to produce the energy that is produced by 1 ton of oil, right? So that is like ton of oil equivalent. So all the energy sources are converted into oil equivalent, and then from IPCC, if you look at various IPCC reports, they have some estimates on what is the emission intensity of each carbon or each fossil fuel, right? Coal, oil, gas, and others. Now, in the input-output table, you will find out how much coal are you using to produce something, how much oil, how much gas, how much petroleum products are you using. And that physical unit, is then combined with this emission intensity to understand the emissions. So now to produce each commodity, how much emissions are generated, CO2 emissions, right? It can be CO2, it can also be non-CO2, it can be greenhouse gas emissions also, other greenhouse gas emissions too. So once you know this, once you know the emissions generated by the combustion of fossil fuels for each industry, half of your job is done because you have all these emissions there. at least the emissions accounting is done. So you know what is happening today. So you can say this is the total amount of emissions that are generated, and these are the sources. So you got that aggregate. Now then you have to look into the breakup or the you know what are the different energy sources that create these, right? So if you look at these data, coal is a commodity, but coal is also a industry. So coal as an industry would generate certain emissions because coal also uses oil, gas, and other things. And coal as a commodity also creates emissions in different industries to produce different things. So production of coal, consumption of coal. On both sides, you create emissions. Okay, generate emissions. So that is one thing. So now emissions are done. So emissions accounting is you're able to do. Now we then move to modeling it. Like now, if you want to reduce these emissions, how will you reduce these emissions? Because practically, forget about economics for now. Practically, how would you reduce emissions? By moving from fossil fuels to renewables, or even by moving from coal to oil, oil to gas. Coal to oil is still a cleaner energy transition. Oil to gas would still be a cleaner energy transition, right? Gas to electricity, irrespective of where the electricity comes from, would still be a cleaner energy transition. And then you get into a conventional source of electricity to renewables. And within renewables, different renewable energy sectors may have different emissions intensities. So now this accounting we are able to do. In order to reduce the emissions, we have to do some modeling. And one of the methodologies that I use a lot is called computable general equilibrium modeling or CGE modeling. So in these models, you capture the whole economy as a combination of linkages between different sectors and different countries. So now, and it also has like input output. A table already captures a lot of that. But beyond that, it also has behavioral equations. So it will say that you have substitution between coal and all other commodities. Then you have substitution between oil and oil and other commodities. Then you have substitution between gas and electricity. So there could be different levels of substitution between the different energy commodities. Now next the concept of carbon tax comes into picture. So now if you impose a carbon tax, which means that it is more expensive to produce anything using fossil fuels, then through the price mechanism, you will move away from coal, you will go towards oil. You'll go away from oil, you'll go towards gas. You'll go away from gas to electricity. Within electricity, you'll move towards renewables. So this kind of transition happens through the carbon taxes. So in the model, when we impose a carbon tax, all these transitions would happen, and then you would see, okay, it is good and bad. Now that's how we say it's good and bad. It's good because renewables are going to expand. It is bad because the fossil fuels are going to fall, and it is also bad for countries which have no renewables today. If you have no renewables today, that means it's a huge infrastructural spending that you have to do to create that renewable infrastructure and then move all your existing production to that. So this is a phenomenon called technology lock-in, that you're locked in with the fossil fuel technologies and you're not able to move towards others. So these are the different mechanisms in our input-output table, then the behavioral equations. And with this, then we then project towards the future and see, okay, by 2030, these are the targets. If you impose those targets, how much are we going to achieve? I mean, assuming that we achieve those targets, what would happen to the economy? Will it be a burden on the economy because the transition is too expensive, or is it going to be a boon for the economy because transition is opening opportunities in new sectors? So So these are the different trade-offs that come out of this kind of modeling exercises. So as you can imagine, a lot of the things I just told you, I told you without showing you any slides or equations and numbers, but hopefully it still makes sense. All these technical things can also be approximated with some back of the envelope calculations. If you do some simple calculations in Excel with simple math, you can also arrive at some numbers. So that's what typically the policymakers do. They say, okay, how is it going to affect my coal sector? How is it going to affect my oil industry? These kind of calculations are done. Typically, you just take it as a positive or negative impact and then go ahead. I mean, without doing any analysis, we can say that decarbonization is going to be negative for coal, oil, and gas. It's going to be positive for renewables, right? So that much we can say. And now, uh, the more important question that's been very challenging to address in any kind of economic analytical framework is where is the money going to come from for energy transition, right? So if you think that the money has to come from the private sector, uh, that means that it has to have some returns on investment, right? The private sector is not going to blindly do this, although there is a lot of talk about sustainability, decarbonization, CSR, ESG, all kinds of things are being talked about, but a lot of them are greenwashing, like what you can call as greenwashing. They may say that you are doing something, but they may not be actually moving the needle on decarbonization, right? So these are all going on. How do we uh, get these investments? So private sector is going to be challenging unless there is a financial case or return on investment. And yes, that has been there. Like particularly whenever the oil prices go up, then renewables become economically viable, and there are a lot of investments. That's how all the recent investments in renewables happen because it actually makes economic and financial sense to invest in them. But it's not always the case. When oil prices do come down, now we can expect in the next few years in the US, with the new administration coming in, oil production may increase and prices may come down. So with all these things, the private sector investments are going to be tricky. Now, and also there is a lot of, I also spoke about energy efficiency. So a lot of R&D is required to reduce the inefficiencies, right? R&D investments are needed. So now that is one aspect, right? The second is public investment. If the government invests, where does it invest in? Does the government um, set up all these renewable energy facilities, or do they give this R&D investment incentives, or they provide other kinds of incentives for the green energy sector to expand? Now, again, we all know there is no manna from heaven. So if the government has to spend this money, it should get the money from somewhere. So it's either through taxation. So your tax burden can increase, that can be inflationary, or it can be through um, some borrowings, which also can lead to inflation over time. It can be domestic borrowing or external borrowing, and that can affect your you know, capital account deficit, you can even fiscal deficit and so on. So a lot of these fiscal aspects will have to be considered. In terms of the private sector, again, it can be domestic private investment or foreign investment, right? Again, the same calculations would come into picture, like capital account deficit and so on. Now, if the return on investment, I think that is the element that can solve this puzzle, right? If the return on investment is high enough, then investments, the way I explained to you about investments so far, it appear like a burden. It's like a burden and it's a cost. Now, if the returns are so high, then it won't anymore be a cost because it will pay for itself. You invest and then it's paid for itself, right? So these are some technical aspects that we have to consider, right? There are practical aspects that we have to consider technically to see what are the trade-offs, and that's what we have been doing in many of the studies. For those of you who are interested, I can share with you the studies we have published with the Asian Development Bank, with the African Exim Bank, in which all these trade-offs are considered and in a quite in-depth way, doing all this modeling and so on. I'm just giving you the higher level message, and that's it. Now, this is all macro, and at micro level, it is still work in progress. It's very, very challenging. I know for more than a decade ago, I have seen a really interesting data set in Sweden, which actually had a data set on emissions by at company level. They had emissions at company level, each company, and it's not even sample, it's the entire population. They had data on all the companies in Sweden. How much emissions do they produce? Each and what kind of emissions they produce. And one of my academic friends that he shared this with me, and we did some analysis on that. So you have that kind of data in some of these developed countries, smaller countries who have the luxury of collecting the data on population rather than sample. But in countries like India or even US for that matter, it's very difficult. Large economies, it's very difficult to do that. But there are a lot of startups coming up now which can track emissions on the go, at a at a company level, at a plant level, and so on. So that's an area that is getting a lot of prominence nowadays among the startups. There's a lot of investments going in. Investors nowadays, there is an ESG investment sector, right? A lot of venture capitalists are particularly focusing on that. They're focusing not on the purely economic returns, but on this kind of socio-economic ESG impact, right? So all this, deeply technical, startups, technology intensive startups are coming up, and they are doing a great job in this, helping the companies to be transparent about emissions. Technologies like AI, blockchain, and Internet of Things, IoT, cloud, all these different technologies are being used there. Of course, we have to look into the technology footprint also, the carbon footprint of technologies also. But all these things are going on, and I feel like that's the only way we can collect it at a granular level. Of course, governments also can do like the way Sweden did. They can do this kind of data collection um, in some of the surveys and census and so on. As part of the census and surveys, they can make it mandatory to get some measure of emissions, or the other way is to have a detailed inventory on what kind of exact technology they're using, and then impute some emissions, right? Because right now we can also do that. If you know, for example, if a particular production, a particular industry is producing using a particular technology, you can say that, okay, this technology is carbon intensive, this technology is not carbon intensive, and so on. And we may have some aggregate data that can be applied to that particular company. So those kind of things can be done. And maybe if some of you are interested, you can look at, let's say in India, we have this prowess data, CMA prowess data, and that gives you the production, like a lot of financial data for each company. And if you go there and then say, and go to the input output table and see the emissions intensity of a particular sector, and then you impose that intensity to the turnover of a particular company in that sector. Let's say sugar, to produce one rupee worth of sugar, you generate so much CO2 emissions. Now, if there is a sugar company and see their turnover, you multiply the turnover by carbon intensity, right? Then you get some kind of emission idea. If you do this for all the sectors, all the companies, then you get an aggregate information on what's the emissions generated by the organized public limited companies. And similar things can also be done for unorganized sector and so on. So these are some ways to measure at aggregate and disaggregate levels. and also to do all this analysis on carbon reduction, decarbonization, and so on.
Thank you so much, sir. It was like quite a comprehensive view for all of us who are like studying nowadays and hearing a lot about carbon emissions and measuring them. I have another question, maybe. I want you to throw some light on climate financing instrument and basically the funds which are there. So we have been hearing a lot about the last COP where the loss and damage fund was adopted by the COP, and nowadays they're actually working on implementing that loss and damage fund. Just let us know about how exactly loss and damage fund is going to help us, and how exactly there are these funds which are already there: the adaptation fund, the mitigation fund, and then there is this green GCF which is also there. Just let us know how exactly these funds work, and where is the funding coming from, and uh, in what kind of projects is it going?
Uh, In the Kyoto Protocol and some of the previous arrangements, we had things like clean development mechanism and so on, and they were not very. I mean, they were very good ideas, but in terms of implementation, there were a lot of holes. So that is why they came up with these kind of. I mean, when I say holes, what I mean is the fund that is supposed to go for emissions reduction would end up going for something else, like some kind of greenwashing efforts and so on, right? So now the this fund that you mentioned, the fund for responding to loss and damage, in COP 28 and currently in COP 29, it's basically it has uh, different developed and developing countries. I think around a dozen developed countries, or maybe a couple more developing countries, probably 12 and 14, if I remember well. 12 developed countries, 14 developing countries, 26 in total. And so now what they do is they um, work together and to understand what is right. First of all, they come up with some kind of publications to understand how this kind of uh, loss and damage fund can work actually. So the idea is uh, the the poorer countries, or the uh, a- apart from whatever I told you so far, where the poorer countries have to grow, and for growing they need they need some flexibility in terms of emissions reduction, otherwise they'll suffer. Apart from that, there's also a lot of research that suggests that the poorer countries, the vulnerable developing countries, they are the ones that actually suffer from damage from the climate change much more than the others. One, it could be because of the lack of funds for adaptation, sea level rises and submergence of coastal areas and so on. That can have a huge impact on the developing countries because they're not able to adapt and move on. Secondly, as a population, there are more poor people in the developing countries. So, in the developed countries, you have a lot of people who have the ways and means. They can actually shield themselves from climate change. Let's say you have a heat wave, you can sit in the AC and avoid that. If you have extreme cold, again, you can have a good shelter. In the developing countries, there are a lot of people without those kind of facilities. Right? So now that means that the climate financing has to be done, particularly focusing on these vulnerable developing countries, and the money should come from the developed countries. So So all this, in fact, the first time this was discussed was in COP21 in 2015, which was basically the Paris Agreement. But the financial mechanism was actually not, decided then. The first time it was actually decided in a concrete way was in 2022 with COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. So after that, the governing instrument was agreed in COP28 in Dubai. So many European countries and even the UAE, they pledged around $700 million in uh, during the COP28 actually. So, but the annual requirement is much more actually. So the estimate is that this initial pledges are about less than 0.2% of estimated annual requirement. So now this is being um, discussed now. Now the mechanism is there, the fund is established, the pledging is going on. Now this has to be then uh, uh, provided to the developing countries. There are various things people have been thinking in terms of prevention aspects, preventative recovery aspects, rehabilitation, reconstruction, addressing the loss and damage coming from the uh, climate change. All these are happening right now, and here this focus is purely on loss and damage. This is one aspect. The green climate fund you mentioned, and there is also other things like adaptation funds, and also all these multilateral development banks like World Bank and Asian Development Bank, African Development. All these banks, we have been working closely with them. They're all concerned about how do we ensure that the development process that happens, because they are focusing on helping countries to boost their economic growth and development. How does that connect with green transition? So that is the focus of these funds. Whereas the loss and damage fund is particularly focusing on what happens when we like when we fail, which we already failed in many ways. We have all these extreme weather events and many other things that keep happening over time. Like extreme weather events can happen every now and then. There also can be slow onset events where this kind of submergence can happen over time and so on. So in a way, you can call it like adaptation, particularly focusing on the loss and damage coming from the climate change. So all these things are there, and there is, as I mentioned briefly before, also been part of some discussions about reforming international finance, World Bank and IMF and so on. So how do we make sure that they take into consideration this kind of climate damage and so on? So yeah, so these are my broad observations. This is all work in progress, but at least now there are some institutional mechanisms which have some real money now to be allocated to the developing countries.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much for throwing so much of light into this, and it really makes so much sense and it's clearing a lot of confusion that we had earlier. Now the floor is open for the questions. Those who have questions can raise your hand and just yes. Mansha, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for the very articulate session. One question that I think comes up in my mind when we talk about this is, can there, like on a real-time basis, be an international mechanism in place, particularly focusing on climate finance? And if not, then what changes do you think can be made to make the already, existing institutions to adapt to these energy transitions and to these financial demands that are obviously the need of the hour? Thank you.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, definitely this organizations like World Bank and IMF and so on, they are currently working on that. I've been part of some of the discussions, as I mentioned, on reforming international finance. So the institutions are changing, and even I've also been in some discussions with the capital markets, right? The financial markets, the investment banks, and so on. They also have been deeply involved in this. So like many of these banks have climate resilience funds and all kinds of things. So private sector is also proactive. Um, but I think that the government institutions are also taking this forward. But I think we still the speed at which this is done and the real transformation that is happening is relatively slow. Uh, So I think, and then as I already mentioned a couple of times, greenwashing is a problem. Like many times we don't see changes on the ground. So that is where we need the institutional transition happening. You see, the Europeans have been quite proactive. This CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, deforestation regulations. They've come with a lot of these things, which can go a long way. Again, they're also controversial because they are in many ways. They don't take into consideration the difficulties that the developing countries are facing. But still, in terms of intent, it's a good. These are good moves, but in terms of implementation, there can be some changes. But yeah, somebody has to push the agenda forward. So that role has been played by the European countries. Now in the US, as you know, there are a lot of changes, so there's less, potentially less emphasis will be laid on the this whole climate change discussion. So that is worrisome. But at the same time, even in the US, um, the the renewable energy sector has been expanding purely because of market reasons, as I mentioned earlier. When the oil prices increase, the renewables become more competitive. So not because of any climate reason, but just because of economic reasons, financial reasons, the uh, renewable energy industry is also expanding. So yeah, I think the transitions are happening in a very heterogeneous way in different countries, even within a country in different institutions. But we are, at least broadly, we're marching towards the right direction. But as um, well-known activists like Greta Thunberg, these kind of people say, we are very slow compared to what is needed. So that is what is really worrisome globally. So we have to act very fast and solve all these trade-offs that we have, because it's the trade-off. We are not slow purely because of capitalistic reasons. It's also because of various other reasons, like I told you before, the trade-offs and so on. But we have to somehow figure out. We have been sitting on this for a long time. We have to figure out and move fast. The transition has to be much faster.
Surely, sir. Greta Thunberg and many have been saying that we are slow, and that's majorly the reason because there are other like political reasons also. Around the world, major problem for the people is again the same that we are not even getting the poverty and gender inequalities are there, and people understanding and realizing that climate change is an issue. Well, is taking time, but of course, with severe conditions in Delhi, higher AQIs, people are understanding and with just see, I see the hand raised. Maybe we can take the last question and then move ahead. Is that okay, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Sure, sure, Aditi, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
So, sir, how about those countries giving energy subsidies, but now they are forced to put carbon taxes? For example, Malaysia. So, like, what is the way forward in that scenario?
Yeah, actually, the many countries are providing fossil fuel subsidies too, right? And we did some studies on that before. Like Russia, for example, has a lot of fossil fuel subsidies, and even in India we have this power subsidies for farmers, free electricity for farmers, irrespective of where the electricity comes from. So all these different energy subsidies are there in many countries. One of the arguments that I've been making based on the analysis that I've been doing is to, even before doing any kind of carbon taxation, I mean, carbon tax should be there, but let's first plug in these holes, like where like we are subsidizing, like the a counterpart example could be tobacco sector, right? So tobacco, we're all talking about taxing tobacco products, which is important. But at the same time, if you see many countries, there are actually tobacco subsidies, which in India, for example, we have this tobacco board, which is in charge of promoting tobacco, like to production and so on. So this is very contradictory, right? We want to reduce these, but we have organizations and funds to promote this. So subsidies should definitely go down. Malaysia example is also very pertinent, you mentioned. And the the way the countries are handling this now is to, I mean, the subsidies are like, again, in the Indian context, the power subsidy is extremely sensitive. You cannot say that, okay, I'm going to eliminate these power subsidies because these are not benefiting poor farmers, they're only benefiting rich farmers, and so on. Again, we'll see huge protests and so on, right? It's politically, it's very sensitive. Same thing for many other countries. Energy subsidies is a very sensitive topic, but there should be some way to do that. Subsidy reduction may be an easier strategy compared to tax increase. Because tax increase, again, CBAM, we are looking at a lot of controversies happening globally. Many countries are criticizing Europe and so on. So before that, if we reduce these subsidies and then do all this taxes, that might be a better way forward. If you keep these subsidies and then tax, then probably the governments are doing that to keep that lever. Okay, I'll increase these taxes, but then don't worry, I'll give you the subsidies so you can pay these taxes, right? So this kind of leveraging is happening. But yeah, from a climate perspective, we should avoid these things by just reducing the subsidies and increasing the taxes, carbon taxes. From an economic perspective, purely economic perspective, by not one thing I never spoke today about, and but which we have considered in many of our studies, is that uh, it is a bit misleading to say that, like, bucket into environmental issues and economic issues, right? Because uh, you may say that, okay, emissions fall, but then the economic growth also falls. That is not true, because when emissions fall, there is a damage associated with emissions, right? So if emissions fall, then those damages also fall, which actually translates into economic growth. So that many people don't consider that. They just think that there is a trade-off between environment and economy. But if emissions are reduced, it's going to be good for the economy. They're going to avoid a lot of these disasters and tragedies, right? So once you factor that in most of the studies, when we did that calculation, okay, transitioning to green energy is going to reduce emissions, but it's also going to reduce growth. But then if you take into account the reduction in emissions and the corresponding increase in growth coming from the reduced emissions, that then the net effect is positive. So once you take this into consideration, then this elimination of subsidies or increasing carbon taxes would not be a problem. Again, from first principles, from economics perspective, um, we are basically internalizing the externalities, right? So by imposing a carbon tax, by reducing the subsidies, what we're saying is that the market has failed to take into consideration um, the emissions and the economic damage caused by that, and that is not taken in the price signaling. Now we have to do that using a policy, and we are not actually distorting the economy. We are only increasing the market efficiency or reducing the market failure probability by imposing these taxes, right? And eliminating these subsidies. So in my mind, both are very complementary. Reduce subsidies or increase taxes, they're complementary. So you can actually have a combination of these policies, reducing tax subsidies and
Surely, sir. So I believe that there's this one thing going on that we cannot completely remove these fossil fuels in this traditional norm of energy that was going on. But of course, we are moving forward to a more sustainable, and there's this transition which is going on for which we need fund and we need people's resilience to work forward on in this direction. So thank you so much. So the session was really very insightful. Now I'd like to call Abhinandan Kaul, who is our founding executive board member, to just conclude with a few words for you.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. So, good evening, everyone. As we come to the close of today's session, I would like to take a moment to express our gratitude to all the people who made tonight's event a success. So, first and foremost, a very big thank you to our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Badri Narayanan Gopalkrishnan ji, for spending time here and sharing his invaluable insights with us. So, sir, your depth of knowledge and your expertise is a true inspiration for all of us who, as youth, aspire to play a greater role in climate advocacy and to make a positive impact for our planet. And we are truly, fortunate to have been given this opportunity to learn some things from you and to engage with you and discuss various aspects of these issues with you. I would also like to thank our director Mansha for giving the introduction and for kickstarting today's session, and also to Vaishnavi, our founding president. She did a very good job moderating today's session. And also a big thank you to everyone who joined us today. Your active participation is actually what makes these sessions very meaningful, and we are truly appreciative of the support that you have given us. And lastly, I would like to reiterate that this conversation on emissions and decarbonization and climate change is far from over. It's an ongoing journey, and we all must, at our own levels, in personal and professional levels, I think, continue to engage with it. And I hope that tonight's discussion has inspired further thought within all of us, and it should inspire further action and collaboration also, hopefully. So thank you all once again. We look forward to having you all with us in future events and sessions of Climate Cadets Collective. Thank you, and have a good night, everybody. Thank you.